So why don't you give us your name and tell us a little bit about your experience in the military?
Yeah, so my name's Karissa. I was a meteorologist in the Air Force for about 7.5 years, just under 8. I got out about a year and a half ago. And now I'm just living through this chaos that we're currently in. Um, my experience in the military did have a lot of underlying tones of being in a male dominated industry. And there are a lot of takeaways from that. Definitely.
So maybe you could be a little more specific about some of your experiences. I think when we talked before, you had mentioned about things like kind of being looked down on, or maybe not in the minds of some men being credible or something like that. Maybe you could be a little more specific.
Yeah, so while I was active duty, it is just assumed if you're female, you're a dependent, that you're not the active duty member. And that comes in a lot of places. That comes from when you ask if there's a military discount at a restaurant, and they were like, "Oh, is your husband active duty?" And you're like, "Well, no, I am." Or at the clinic when they ask for your sponsor's social security number, because it couldn't possibly be your own social security number, that would be the healthcare number. So things like that. But then also, while active, hearing the tones change of conversations once they realize there's a female around. So there's so often not, that the conversations are very, very, very different from when they are talking amongst themselves to when they notice that there's a female around them. And so one of my offices was a cubicle situation of like 3 small cubicle areas with about 5 people per area. So I was kind of tucked away and not everyone could see me. And they were just, I mean, it was the most misogynistic, sexist, horrible conversations with people that I thought I knew, that I would be like, "Oh, he's a nice guy, he'd never say something like that." But they were. And then it was kind of a group think thing. And then when I'm like, "Excuse me, like, sorry to ruin the party, but I'm here and I can hear you." And then everybody was so scared and talking about how I was gonna say something and they were all gonna get paperwork for it, like it was my fault that they were talking about those things just because I heard it. But then as I got out of the military and my husband is still active duty, now I live in this strange world as a female veteran, but also a dependent, but nobody would ever see the veteran. It's just assumed. There's no question of if I served, it's just, "Oh, you're a dependent." And so I get talked down a lot by male veterans, especially older ones. But even sometimes other female veterans will be like, "Oh, you're a veteran too?" Like this just utter surprise, that certainly no man ever gets when they say that they're a veteran.
Wow. I mean, there's such a strong parallel between, racism and other forms of discrimination that are kind of built on a lot of these kind of biases or assumptions, which
Yes.
are particularly dangerous. But what's really amazing about it, in some ways, is that with all the accomplishments and all the things that women have done, and women in combat and things like that, you would think that just based on the last maybe 10 years of women doing the work of men, that this wouldn't even exist. So does this kind of reality, has this affected your behavior? And what I mean by that is sometimes I've heard of even people of color, for instance, say, well, when if you work in a white world or in a field dominated by white people, you have to be twice as good, or you have to be twice as loud, or something like that. Do you feel that kind of pressure?
Definitely. Like I almost feel like as soon as somebody talks about my husband being in the Air Force, it's like I feel so compelled to be like, I serve too. Like I just have to like lash out. Like, no, I'm a veteran too. Like I know all too well. Or like when people are telling me about how veterans think or feel, I know how they think and feel because I am one. And you definitely see a lot of women fall victim in the military to trying too hard to be one of the guys. And it oftentimes gets them in precarious situations where they're the only girl with 10 other guys and they think that they can trust them, and then they go out drinking because they're one of the guys. They're, that's her brothers. They would never do anything to her, but that's simply not true. I've seen it happen. It's oftentimes, and statistically oftentimes, sexual assault and things is by people, by friends, by acquaintances, people you're like, they're all right, I know them, but you don't actually, especially when they get among 10 others who are kind of like them, like, oh well, she's my friend but she's kind of hot, like, and behind the scenes, because I've heard it, that they're saying, oh, like, she's kind of hot, I'd sleep with her.
Well,
That's
percentage
your friend.
wise, let me ask you this: percentage wise, in general, of the your male counterparts, the people of different men of different ranks, what would you say is the percentage of men that are kind of like that? Because sometimes, it's like racism. It's like with the police right now. I believe that most cops are good cops, but some people would say, well, 99% of them are good. Someone would say only 40% of them were good. What would you say about just your experience with men in the military?
It is very disappointing. um it is wildly disappointing, because they it's almost the same thing with the cops. If there's one bad cop and six other good cops see that bad cop do something and doesn't say anything, you've got seven bad cops. Like, they're all bad if they're not going to stand up for it. And I'd say the perpetrators of the most sexist, misogynistic, and assault-like harassment stuff is pretty small. The problem is that the good guys don't speak up. And so it's just commonplace. Well, we're just a bunch of guys. That's what we talk, or that's what's said. But it shouldn't be said, and the good guys don't say often enough that it's wrong. And that is a much larger problem. Or you have people who hear something incredibly sexist to somebody who recognizes it, but because it's never registered that that's a sexist comment, they go along with it, or they just doesn't register as being wrong. Like, I mean, they would tell the women to, oh, it's lunchtime, are you going to go make us a sandwich? Like, isn't that what you're here for? Did you bring the skillet? you know
Ha
so,
ha
and
ha ha! Like it's a joke, right? Oh,
it's
it's
a
only a
joke to them.
joke. Yeah.
It's not a joke. It's like, I'm here doing the exact same things you did. And I mean, having been injured in combat training, I I get really offended by people who tell me that I was in the chair force and I didn't work hard when I had a catastrophic injury that still affects me today and will for the rest of my life. To say that I'm in the chair force and I didn't really serve, I mean, it's incredibly offensive. And they'll say things like, oh, did you break it? You slipped and fell out doing the dishes, stuff like that. And it's incredibly offensive.
Well, if
But
anything,
I think the
go ahead. Sorry.
oh, I was gonna say the percentage of people who say the most overt terrible thing are 25%, which is still pretty high, but I'd say almost 90% would just giggle and not say anything about it. I mean, it's a disgusting number. And I've seen my people I considered friends that I'd known for a year plus go out and do things to people that they thought were too drunk to notice. And I've seen it, and I'd be like, wow, I really never thought I would see that person do that. And then they did.
Showing their true colors. Well, my last question is, what would you tell a woman who is thinking about entering the military in relation to what you've just talked about? I mean, to kind of help her be aware of what she might have to deal with.
I've advised a lot of women who were thinking about going in the military, and I did a lot of research before I joined. Um, and initially, I was thinking about the Army, and then when I read about it, And it was because my mom was in the Air Force and I didn't want to do what she did. So I was like, I'm not going to join the Air Force. I'll go Army. So I started researching it, and the sheer numbers of sexual assaults and harassment were out of control. The Air Force, and where there are more of us, that we have more of a voice. And I think that I would advise women to join the Air Force, which is a terrible thing because they shouldn't be like join this branch to be heard and maybe not assaulted. But I know my Marine friends, my Navy friends, I mean, the stories are absolutely appalling, and it's still not great in the Air Force, obviously, but there is power in numbers. And it's not as big of a branch, so your weight has more movement, so you don't get lost in the sauce as much. But also knowing your own worth is incredibly important before joining the military, because as a woman, if you don't love and respect yourself, you absolutely will not receive that in the military. They will use you and abuse you, and bad things happen to people who are just looking for approval. So if you're a female seeking approval in your male counterparts, it's gonna end poorly. So those are probably, I would think very strongly about the Air Force, and I would also definitely know your own self-worth well before you enter the military, because you're gonna lose yourself if you don't, for sure.
That's great advice. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.